major support for the 10 is brought to you by Protocase, builders of electronic enclosures for scientists, engineers, and innovators, the Cape Breton Partnership, and the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, 45 Drives, experts in large storage, and Navigate Startup House. The 10 is produced by Navigate Startup House.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in a tiny house? Well, I did. And so in 2015, I packed up my family and we moved to a series of tiny houses for 1 month. And one of the really interesting things about it was that while we were living tiny, I was able to interview people who were residing in tiny houses, people who were building them, and people who were movement advocates. And even though the tiny houses that we stayed in differed, some were different sizes and they had different amenities and they were in different communities, one of the things that they allowed us to understand was what it was like to live in a smaller housing footprint. And some of the communities that we stayed in have decided to waive the building or permitting fees for people who decide to build auxiliary dwelling units, or ADUs. And these are essentially backyard sheds or garages that have been converted into a livable space. And one of the things that they do is they allow people to be able to offer up more housing density, which is a good thing. And they also allow for housing for students or for an aging parent or for people who want to increase the amount of revenue that they have in their own lives. They can rent them out to people and then they have enough money to pay for their own mortgage. And when you have this kind of density, it also means that you create more walkable communities, and you have the ability to offer up smaller housing footprints for people at a more affordable cost. So I just want to start tonight with, not to sound cliche, but a tiny video of us living in tiny houses. It's 2 minutes long, and as I go through it, I'll just explain what you're seeing. So this is one of those ADUs, and that's my daughter. And this is the kitchen inside of it, and you can see above there's a loft space. And one of these folded out into a bed for my daughter. This was a tiny house that was a houseboat. So we got to stay on a floating tiny house. And it was really beautiful because they had 2 sides that were windows facing out into the river. This was a little backyard garage conversion, and you can see we still had our technology with us. It was probably the largest one we stayed in. It was about 450 square feet, as was this one. And that was a backyard conversion as well. Time lapse to show what it's like to live in a tiny house. So we had a little kitchen. I often think when I see this that I don't seem to sit still very often. That I'm cooking, making a meal for us. My daughter is upstairs. I don't know what she's doing, goggles on under the covers, whatever. It's kind of kooky, but you know, living our lives. And I also felt kind of self-conscious after I saw this that there seems to be a glass of wine in front of me on every occasion. Which I don't think that was anything to do with tiny house living. It's more just me. This was a tiny house on wheels, and it was the smallest one. It was 170 square feet. And what you can see is that I am unpacking because we did not have room for our suitcase. So I put it in the trunk of the car. But I was dividing up our clothes, putting some in the closet. Some were going upstairs in the little carry-on suitcase. And this is the final one we stayed in. It was a geodesic dome in the redwood forest in California. And again, you can see the living space. This little bed folded down. There was a bed upstairs, and behind the curtain was the washroom. And all around us were these giant redwood forests, and my glass of wine just went away. Don't judge me. All right. So One of the things that really stood out for me when we tried out tiny house living was I love the simplicity of living in a smaller housing footprint. And part of that was having just enough. So we had just enough clothing so that we had an appropriate outfit for the weather conditions, or if we were going to be doing something special that day, like hitting a pool or the beach, we'd be able to have a bathing suit. And this picture is from one of the tiny houses that I showed you, and it shows that we had just enough dishes to be able to each have a plate, bowl, mug, and cutlery. Yeah. And one of the things that stood out for me was having just enough wasn't a lesson that I normally have in my day-to-day life. So that, and it's probably not a lesson that many of us can expect to have in our shop till you drop, consumption-driven society. But what a powerful message it is, that we can be happy with just enough, and probably more important for me was the recognition that I could have too much. And if you think about it, entire industries have been created to deal with having too much. So if you take things like the residential storage market, where people pay a fee every month to house the stuff that they no longer want or have no place in their lives for. And this is even when our housing has changed dramatically. So back in 1945, the average house size in Canada was 800 square feet. And in 2010, it was closer to 2,000 square feet. And even though the amount of housing space we have has grown, the number of people that we can expect to share that space has gone down. So in 1945, the average household size was 4 people, and by 2011, it was only 2.5. And it's not just that we have bigger houses with smaller amounts of people living in them, but it's inflated the amount of space that we actually think we need. And so, what's really interesting is that we have people thinking they need to have bigger spaces and more stuff, but it isn't actually bringing them a sense of feeling better about their lives. And so, one of the things that happens is that a bigger space leads to more stuff because people feel like they need to fill it. And it also leads to less time because of all of the housekeeping and upkeep that people have to participate in. And the other thing around it is that it costs a lot more money. So people pay more for their mortgages, for their taxes, and for their heating and cooling costs. And they're also more environmentally taxing because we need more resources to build them, and we have to heat and cool them. So a smaller housing footprint, like the one you see here, and there I am working at the table with this beautiful view around me, can actually help to facilitate a different, easier, and more enriching lifestyle, allowing us to live our lives less burdened by clutter and stuff. Tiny house dwellers often have more time to be able to take part in pursuits that are meaningful for them. They get to make decisions about the kind of work that they want to do because they have a lot more flexibility because of the amount of money that they don't have to spend because of a conventional house. So the smaller housing footprint can actually help to facilitate the kind of lifestyle that we desire. People often ask me what qualifies as a tiny house, and I would say that this is a great question, but it isn't actually one that has a simple answer. Some people say that a tiny house is under 400 square feet, some say 800, but I prefer the definition that comes from Jay Schaefer, who's credited with being the founder of the tiny house movement. And he argues that we really shouldn't be so hung up on finding a definition that meets the size requirements, or finding a size requirement that meets the definition. Instead, he argues that we should think about how efficiently a space is being used. And so he says if you have 20 people living in a 4,000 square foot house, they're probably living tiny. Besides the benefits of a smaller housing footprint, like spending less money and having more time for the activities that are meaningful for us, and being able to spend more time with the people that we care about, there are also important benefits for the community because, as other researchers have previously pointed out, it takes a town in order to live tiny. Sometimes when I tell people about the tiny house movement, they seem to get really hung up on all of the things that they think that they would miss from their conventional house, like their home gym equipment, or their book collection, or their home entertainment system. And I would say to those people, you're partially right. You can't have everything in a tiny house. But this is a rather short-sighted understanding of what it means to live well. And I would say that when we think about the community building benefits of sharing, so think about when you go to the local YMCA to work out, or when you go to the library and access the amazing resources and things that they've organized there, or when you go to the Hat and take in an amazing performance. These are the enriching experiences in our lives, and they help to build a better quality of life. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that it helps us to recognize that the space outside of our homes is actually an extension of our, I got so excited, of our living space. I'll just tell you before I go on, but this is a tiny house hotel in Portland, Oregon, where people can stay the night. They have a series of them. And for people that are really into the tiny house movement, this is Dee Williams' house. She was there that day. So I just thought the picture represented my understanding of what community means, right? So there were all these people mulling about, talking to each other, building a connection, and there was a keg out back as well. I had to actually ask somebody how to prime it. I don't know if people believe that or not, but it's true. I'm a wine drinker. So when we're out in the community, we get to meet other people. We get to form significant and lasting relationships with them. And we get a sense that we're something bigger than these isolated places where we reside. So the message of the tiny house movement is not that everyone will aspire to live in a tiny space, but rather it's a message of hope. The tiny house movement teaches us that we can create lives that are meaningful without consuming, that we can build significant and lasting relationships with other people, and that we can be less taxing on the natural environment. Ultimately, the tiny house movement demonstrates novel ways for us to build lives that are better and bigger with less. Thank you.
We're going to get
The 10 is produced by Navigate Startup House.